Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I'm going to do something very different here because I'm going to get right to the response strategy. Some of you may know my background in climate science, but more recently my response strategy is actually to get engaged in the political system, because I will argue in this presentation that the barriers to dealing with the issue of global warming are neither technological nor behavioral. They are political, and so this will be the little bit about that. For those of you who don't know my background, I've spent many years working in the area of climate science, in particular, more recently in Earth system modeling. We have something known as the UVic Earth system model, which a number of people are using to explore various puzzles in paleoclimatic research, and we've used this as an assessment tool, and I've been involved in a variety of IPCCs. Some of the most recent work we've done on this is with respect to trying to get a handle on the permafrost carbon feedback, and one most recent piece of analysis done by a really bright student, Andrew McDougall, who's now working with Reto Knuti in Switzerland, was to ask the question, what would happen if we turned off all carbon emissions immediately in 2013? What would happen? Would we expect the carbon to naturally decrease, or what would the permafrost carbon feedback do? And so this is summarized in the one figure there, and we do this by exploring through climate sensitivity space. That is, if the climate sensitivity turns out to be 2 degrees, then what happens is after you shut off emissions, slowly you start to draw down carbon, and over a long time you draw down more. If the climate sensitivity turns out to be around 3 degrees, then atmospheric carbon dioxide levels stay about fixed, because the permafrost carbon feedback continues to add carbon as the natural ocean and terrestrial sinks take down carbon. For a permafrost carbon feedback over 4.5, then you have a self-sustaining climate feedback. That is, despite the fact that you no longer have emissions, the inherent emissions coming from permafrost carbon feedback is such that you continue to warm for centuries more. So this is the kind of work I've been doing for some time. Now, many of you who've been involved in the climate business, and in my case it's been since the second assessment report, second, third, fourth, and fifth, you'll recognize that advancements in climate science have been profound in many areas. But if you go back to the 1979 Charney report, the very first national assessment looking at the scientific basis for the projection of possible future climate changes resulting from, even gendered non-neutral language back then, man-made releases of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you find that his estimate, he and his team on this report estimated climate sensitivity to be between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees, with a central estimate of 3. Compared to early estimates done by Arrhenius in 1896 of somewhere between 5 and 6 degrees. The very first climate model, coupled atmosphere-ocean model, done by Minabe and Weatherald in 1975, had it coming in at around 3 degrees. And then you have the 1990 first assessment report, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. The second assessment report, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. The third assessment report, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. The fourth assessment report, big hoopla, Nobel Prize, rah-rah, 2 to 4.5 degrees. Not to be outdone by the fifth assessment report that appeared in 2013, when we're back to 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. So we've had, 34 years of climate science, and the single most descriptive quantity of the response of the climate system to atmospheric carbon dioxide increases, the climate sensitivity, has been unchanged. So one might pose the following statement as a summary of the IPCC assessment and a number of bullets, is it's essentially more of the same with slightly greater certainty. So the question then one's left with is, what are the challenges to deal with this? The science is not going to change this 1.5 to 4.5 degrees by any great amount in any time soon. We've got enough science to know what the issue is. What we don't have is the political will. And let me see if I can address why with this one image here, and then give you an example from the British Columbia experience. This is an example that came out of the 2007 assessment report, which shows 6 figures in 2 columns. Under 3 emissions trajectories, the B1, which is relatively benign growth in emissions, A1B, which was the old business as usual type approach, and A2 is like the fossil fuel intensive Chinese economy burn coal approach that's happening now. And if you looked at the climate change projected from many models averaged together over the next couple of decades, that's 2020 to 2029, it's very difficult to discern any difference between any of those plots. But if we look to the latter part of the century, the differences are quite dramatic, depending on the decisions that are made in terms of the emissions trajectories. So this boils the entire issue of global warming down to one question. Do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment that they inherit? And some might say no, and some might say yes. Science will never answer that question. Science can inform that question by saying, if we don't do something this, if we do something that. So this also points then directly to the political barriers. Most politicians go into politics with the 4-year goal of getting re-elected. Yet you can imagine a politician who brings in emissions pricing, quite aggressive emissions pricing, 4 years from now, cannot point to anything and say that this is a direct consequence of the policies that I brought to the table, because 4 years from now, whether or not that policy was brought in is irrelevant. The climate system response is the climate system response because of the socioeconomic inertia in our systems. However, you might imagine appealing to a demographic over the age of 60 to 70, of which in Canada at least between 70 and 80% vote. And you might say, you know, listen what, I'm going to reduce hip and knee replacement lineups in the next few years. And then sure enough, you can do that and point to these lineups. And people then will say, you know, he listened or she listened to me, I'll vote them back in. So our whole political systems are set up for failure to address the mother of all tragedy of the commons, which is this problem of global intergenerational equity and global warming. We have on the international level an absolutely profound disconnect between science and policy, as beautifully illustrated in the 2009 Copenhagen Accord, which 114 nations took note of, whatever that means. What we can say is that if and this some nice calculations done out of Switzerland, is that if all countries met their voluntary targets, 2 degrees would almost certainly be broken, with 3 degrees having a 50% chance this century and 4 degrees shortly thereafter. And this was done a number of years back, and of course it's much greater probabilities because we've had 4 years of increasing growth since that time. So there's a profound disconnect between science and policy, which is getting no better in the Peru recent meeting, where grave concern was noted about the significant gap between the aggregate effective parties' mitigation pledges in terms of global emissions and trying to meet the 2 degrees. So they agree to note the grave concern, but then do nothing about it. So again, this is, in my view, another example of the political barriers that are happening. And there's a beautiful case study in British Columbia, the province that I'm from and where now I'm sitting in government. Greenhouse gas, in the province of British Columbia, we had a leader. His name was Gordon Campbell. He's now the ambassador for Canada in England, who had a vision for long-term policy and put in place with his team what I would like to describe as the most beautiful potpourri of climate policies, which could act like knobs and buttons that you can tune and twist to actually get the emissions response you want. There was targets to start off with, but targets by themselves are meaningless. A carbon tax should be called carbon levy to make it more palatable, brought in, that actually sent a signal to market. It was revenue neutral, so the money that came in went right back in through income and corporate tax deductions. The Greenhouse Gas Cap and Trade Act was brought in, some enabling legislation to work with California when theirs were to come in. We had other landfill gas management regulations. We had low carbon fuel requirements, emissions standards, Local Government Statutes Act, Utilities Commission, the Clean Energy Act, a whole bunch of policies that were put in place to actually not shock the economy, but actually nudge the economy into a direction of the creation of sustainable energy, producing clean fuel that was entice industry to the province. And our economy responded. The emissions in British Columbia dropped relative to the rest of Canada quite dramatically. Emissions also, you know, but then the naysayers, of course, will say, but it killed the economy. And the evidence is quite clear to the opposite. While emissions dropped something like 17% per capita since the time of the carbon tax was introduced, the actual economy outperformed the Canadian economy. So the evidence is clear. It did not shock the system. It spurned a new economic system, which was our clean tech sector, which took off. But unfortunately, in British Columbia, we went from leader to laggard. That started off here in the Clean Energy Act, which required 93% of our production in BC of electricity to come from renewable power. That was weakened to actually exclude facilities for liquefied natural gas. And then most recently, we created the present government repealed the carbon capture and storage, the Cap and Trade Act, and brought in legislation to move away from emissions reductions to emission intensity reductions, essentially translating to being polluting more efficiently. And so, I had some fun in the legislature here about putting in an amendment to actually change the title from Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act to the Greenhouse Gas Increase and Industrial Reporting Act. Never, needless to say, the government of the day did not support my amendment. But the point was made, and it was made effectively. We've got hype, and this is what happens in politics. When you want to win so desperate, you say what you think people want to hear. People want a message of hope. And this is a message of hope that was given to British Columbians that they voted for a government that no one thought they would win. It was a message of hope wrapped in hyperbole. Liquefied natural gas is the industry that will make British Columbia debt-free. We're going to get a $100 billion prosperity fund, 100,000 jobs. 5 big plants are going to give $1 trillion to our GDP. We're going to actually eliminate the sales tax. Thriving schools and hospitals. Vote for me. Of course, the government gets in. And the government's basing this, I probably don't have time to go over this, on outlandish claims of price projections and world supply and energy markets, excluding the obvious of things like Russia happens to have 20 times the natural gas reserve of all of Canada combined, and they're just announced long-term contracts, ignoring all the other supplies worldwide. The reality is, of course, that China is signing long-term contracts. We've got competition in Australia. The US has got facilities in the south that are ready to go. All they need to do actually is turn the nozzle from in to out because the infrastructure is already there by and large. And we've got the reality that companies are pulling out, but there's no political consequence for this. So this is, the problem that we face. And so as, we know as climate scientists or as geoscientists in general, that their solutions are out there. They fall in 3 categories: technological, behavioral, and the market instruments, which I would argue are critical to actually move the other 2 forward. Now, I don't have time to talk about the tragedy of the commons. Suffice it to say, it is in every single person's best interest, every person in every house, in every municipality, in every province, in every country in the world's best interest to do absolutely nothing about this problem, because the costs of action are borne by them, and the costs of inaction are distributed amongst 7 billion people in the next generation. So, this tragedy of the commons needs to be fixed through market instruments, which requires political courage to do it. We have the wireless technology, we have computers, we put men on the moon, we could put women on the moon. For heaven's sake, we've got a Mars Land Rover going around, the Mars rover now. Yet we're still driving around internal combustion engine-powered vehicles, explosions with pistons. There's reasons for this. So I would argue, and I have argued, that scientists have actually done their job in this problem. We can fiddle around the edges and do some impacts here and, reduce cloud uncertainty. But look, I've been in this game for 25 years. We've been reducing cloud uncertainty for 25 years, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. But so the reality is, it's time, if we want to deal with this problem, it's time for political leadership. They're not. You can either sit around and complain. I've done a lot of that. Or you can get engaged in our democratic systems to try and make a difference. And I did that, and I got elected in British Columbia. I gave as a present a wonderful book put together by the German Council on Global Change, a graphic novel, because most of my colleagues are ADD and couldn't read a scientific paper. But this graphic novel beautifully illustrated the climate issue, and I gave a copy to each and every MLA in British Columbia. And anyway, so what I wanted to say in the end then is that, in fact, I think the time is nigh for us as the community, if we want to see change. Writing op-eds is not going to do it. It's actually get engaged in our political systems ourselves, and if this guy here can win in a riding, which is probably the most conservative, your equivalent Republican, riding in all of British Columbia, which is where the big mansions and stuff, et cetera, if I can get elected there, we can get elected anywhere, and we can actually make a difference because the people are ready for evidence-based decision making. They've got far too much decision-based evidence making out there, and scientists bring that notion that, policy should flow from evidence. In science, the person with the best evidence wins. In politics, unfortunately, it's too often the person who's with the strongest argument wins. Thank you.